I want to bring you back to right here in Michigan, but the 1830s. So Michigan gained statehood in 1837, and we elect Stevens T. Mason as our first governor, who was 25, 26 years old. And we quickly learned a lesson of maybe don't elect somebody at 25 or 26 to run a new state, because Governor Mason had this idea of we really need Michigan to be put on the map. Well, how do we do that? Well, we just need investment. So he launches all these series of government programs to make Michigan compete with states like New York and Virginia. And that includes building canals and railroads and what he called internal improvements and new roadways. And it was very quickly a disaster. This state that had just launched with a lot of promise was very close to bankruptcy within just a couple of years. And the Stevens T. Mason passed away. By the time he died, only 5 years after being elected governor, he had realized this error. He had said this was not the right way to go about policy. It was left to the next governor to kind of solve this problem. And then we got a constitutional amendment voted on by the citizens of Michigan in 1850, that went into effect in 1851, and that permanently, or they thought, was going to remove the government from all these types of investments. Government in Michigan was no longer constitutionally going to be involved in investing and competing in the private market. And it was the first constitution of that kind in the United States, and helped lead to what can be looked back as this age of entrepreneurs. So, Michigan was involved in a bunch of different industries, but by the time you get to the late 1800s and the 1900s, we have taken off as a state. And we've had all these new industries in woodworking and farming and agriculture, ultimately in automotive and chemicals and furniture and all these different things that we have today. And for a period of time during the 1900s, Michigan was the fastest growing state in the nation. We had this great entrepreneurial mindset set forth by government policy. And if you go to 1950 or the 1940s, Detroit was 2 million people. It's down to 600,000 today. And it was the wealthiest place on this planet, was Detroit, Michigan. We've had trouble since then. Michigan has ebbed and flowed, not been as competitive economically with the rest of the country since then. But we've had good policy and bad policy over that time period. And unfortunately, we've been in a series, in my view, of not great policy in recent years. And it's going to take people like you in this room to help turn that around and get us back to this state where we really were a growth state, an entrepreneurial state, a state that wasn't out there picking winners and losers, but was letting entrepreneurs do their thing and becoming a growth state. So I attempted to, we compiled a bunch of ideas at the Mackinac Center that we're calling the Blueprint for a Brighter Future. So my aim of this is to just kind of go through some of the high-level thoughts of how to get Michigan back as a state. So as I mentioned, we were a growth state, but we've fallen behind. From 2000 to 2010, we were the only state to lose population among the 50 states. And we've improved a little bit since then, but not a lot. And really in the 2000s, only West Virginia has performed poorer in terms of population numbers than Michigan. And you hear lots of, Governor Whitmer, lots of people agree this is a problem. Governor Whitmer talked about this when she was campaigning, and like politicians like to do to solve a problem, they started a commission. So she started a commission, and the commission rolled out a bunch of ideas, and they were so bad for the most part that even the governor never mentioned them again. A commission is what you do when you don't want to do the hard work of good public policy. But one of the things that would get mentioned when we were having this debate is people say, well, we've got these cold winters, we've got this weather. Well, some of the fastest growing states have cold winter. Idaho, Montana, North and South Dakota are all growing very rapidly. And then, if you don't like cold winters, you're really not going to like hot summers. So, you got Arizona, Texas, Florida, and Nevada. These are a lot of them, Las Vegas is built in the desert, still growing a lot faster than Michigan is. And of course, last I checked, Michigan had a lot of winters during the 18 and 1900s when we were still growing quite rapidly as a state. And it's not our geology. We have as good a natural resources or better than most states. I mean, look behind me with our water. And we're on an international border. We're connected to the largest canal system and lock system in our country. So we have a lot of advantages as a state. And so what that leads us to is this is primarily policy decisions. And I was talking to a friend recently, and they had grown up in California, and they had moved out of California. And I asked them, so how many of your friends that you grew up with are still living in California? This was somebody in their 40s, and said almost none of them. And I asked where they moved to. They moved to Arizona, they moved to Nevada, some other places. If you've been to Southern California and you've been to Arizona, only public policy explains why Arizona is growing so much faster than California, because it's certainly not the weather. So what are the problems that the state's facing, and what are some of the solutions? So this is tracking population numbers. You can see in those 60s through 70, 75. After 1950, we began kind of matching the population of the country. Prior to that, we were growing faster than the rest of the country. But then we slowed and fallen way behind the rest of the country when it comes to our population growth, to show you the magnitude of the problem. All right, so number one of a big important policy issue that we have to get right, and Michigan right now is not getting right, is reliable and affordable energy. So Michigan pays higher rates than most other states, and in fact, the highest rates in the Midwest, and we get the least reliable rates for our electricity than the rest of the Midwest. And there are interesting studies on this where they adjust for weather-related events. So obviously, you're in Florida, you're going to have hurricanes. We have cold winters here, you have ice. There are adjustments based on that. If you adjust for weather-related events, Michigan has the least reliable electricity in the country. So, good luck selling someone on a state, selling a business coming to a state, selling a major manufacturer to the state. We have very unreliable electricity. By the way, also we have very high rates. I apologize. So, you look across costs, Indiana, Iowa, much lower than the state of Michigan. And if you go back to the early 2000s, Michigan actually had the lowest electricity rates in the Midwest. And one of the reasons was a good policy decision, which was we had a competitive energy sector. You could choose to buy your electricity from a variety of sources. And then in the early 2000s, that got changed at the policy level. And state lawmakers and the governor signed a bill under Governor Granholm that handed essentially a monopoly to two energy providers in the state of Michigan. So depending on where you live at in the state, but pretty much if you look at your bill, you're going to have one choice of who you buy it from. And so the result is super high rates, and of course, we know what happens when you have a monopoly, not known for the greatest of service. So what Michigan needs to do is to get back to turn these numbers around. So you look at major power outages across the Midwest, way higher than the rest of those states. I mean, I can't think of a reason why Michigan has more than five times the power outages major power outages as Minnesota. Certainly not weather-related ideas. So you need a more competitive energy environment like other states have done that do get lower rates and more reliable electricity for families. Next big issue, educational opportunities. Michigan had the unfortunate policy 50 years ago of putting in our Constitution a constitutional amendment that prevents any public spending from going to a private school. So even if you give that money to parents and say, spend this how you want, hire a private tutor, take your kid to public school, go to private school, any of the private operators of that are constitutionally prohibited. That's the strongest anti-school choice amendment in the United States right now. Lots of other states have much more options and choice in the private school environment, and including some of our neighbors, Wisconsin, Indiana, Ohio, and these numbers are from 2023. In 2024, Indiana and Ohio passed universal school choice. That is, you give the money to the parents, you can take it to private school, public school, you can take it to community college, you can take it wherever you want. You can split it up in a variety of ways, trade schools, and it's provided this competitive environment. And there's lots of research out there showing that that type of education system works better for students educationally, but sometimes we focus too much on educationally does it work better for students. Because if you look at things like are parents happier, are kids happier, what's the bullying rates, what's the rate of kids 20 years later, what they do with their life, all these things that are a little bit harder to measure in the short term, these types of programs do much, much more for that. And the most interesting research of all, I say as the son of two public school teaching parents, and my wife was a public school teacher when we got married, is that these programs also make public schools better. When people have to compete over students and think about what programs do we need to offer for families, or maybe our school board should put in policies that are remotely acceptable to our local population, these types of programs help with that because they make everybody more accountable. Michigan has pursued essentially one policy for, they nitpick around the edges. There's some things that get put in place. There's some things that go, out of favor. There's some curriculum changes and tweaks here and there. But for the most part, Michigan's public policy has been, we will give the traditional public school more money, and we'll see what happens with the results. And the results have not been good. So we spend way more money than we used to. If you go back to 1990, so 35 years ago to now, we actually, adjusted for inflation, we spend twice as much per student as we did in the 1980s and up through 1990 today than we did back then. I don't think we're getting twice the better benefits. And, I've shared these thoughts with friends that are teachers or people that work in the educational sector, and one of the things you get is I have friends that are teachers and are like, where's this money going? I know what I'm getting paid, and I haven't seen this jump in payment the way you show on this chart. And so the way this number works out, which is about $15,000 per student in the state of Michigan, so you do the math on that, you're talking somewhere in the range of $300,000 for every classroom. The reason for this is our education system is also mismanaged, as in bargaining agreements with labor, promises of pensions that state taxpayers could not pay. Being able to push that off onto future taxpayers has made us have a very expensive educational system, to the extent that today 40 cents of every dollar we spend on payroll for education goes right into the pension system for past promises that we made decades ago. So we've mismanaged the spending that we are putting into that system. We need a competitive tax system, lower, flatter, fairer taxes. Joe just talked about, mentioned with our corporate tax system, our business taxes, where we have gone the route of keeping taxes on businesses, a proposal right now to significantly raise taxes on businesses, raise taxes on individuals. But the result of that is we have these years where we net out with no gains from business taxes. Taxpayers are losing money on our business tax system because of these massive corporate incentives that we have handed out, often with very little success at best. But Michigan we are not particularly competitive among many of the states around us with property taxes. We're middle of the pack. We're not as bad as Illinois, my home state, Joe's home state, and the reason many people are leaving that state is they can no longer afford to hang on to their homes. But we're well behind a neighboring state like Indiana or a competitor state like Kentucky or some of these southern states. And we hand out a large amount of corporate handouts. We hand out 36 times more money in select business subsidies than the state of Idaho. And Idaho was the #1 growth state in the last 5 years. So not a lot of connection between corporate incentives and economic growth, and also much more than our neighboring state of Indiana, which has much more of a flatter, fairer business tax system. This is a little bit of a confusing chart, but essentially it's tracking, the blue lines are the amount of corporate incentives we approved in individual years, and the orange line is the unemployment rate. So we had this big spike in the 2008-2009 recession. We had, leading up to that, during those kind of what we call the lost decade years, 2002, 2010, we rapidly began expanding the number of credits and subsidies that we were handing out. It did not help prevent this massive spike in unemployment. And in fact, when Governor Snyder came into office after Governor Granholm, he said that corporate incentives were the heroin drip of government. And what he meant by that was, it was like a way of, once you started handing these out, it became very, very difficult to pull them back. Because even if a company didn't meet its projections, they would come back and say, well, yeah, but we just need a little more time and we need a little more money. And if you try to pull these back, of course, we're going to say that as a governor, you're doing a very bad job and you're anti-business. But he was very successful for his, especially in his first term, of pulling back a lot of those incentives. And our unemployment rate was declining. Our business tax environment got much better. And I think we were better off economically as a state. That has gone backwards in the last couple of years here. And one of the things is corporate incentives are a way of covering up bad public policy. That's kind of a theme. Like, politicians go to the easy answer to cover up for mistakes rather than the tougher answer of getting good public policy. It's easy to go and say, I'm at a ribbon cutting, here's millions of dollars for a company, they're going to do all these great things and create jobs. Probably 2-3 years later, when that doesn't work out, you're not really getting the same type of media coverage. And so governors often resort to corporate incentives if the business environment is not doing particularly well while they're in office. And then so Michigan did very, very little in select subsidies prior to the mid-90s. And actually in 1995 was the first time we kind of created what I would call a very major program, the MEGA program. And we kind of tracked the economic growth of the rest of the country for a long, long time. And then for people that say, like, the answer we hear a lot on this is, to be a competitive state, we need these types of programs. But we were a much more competitive state prior to having these programs, and the existence and creation of these series of programs, MEGA and what they call Good Jobs for Michigan and the SOAR program, they always sound great. MEGA subsidy. Good Jobs for Michigan. Who's going to vote against the Good Jobs for Michigan bill? Nobody wants a press release against them about that. SOAR, maybe we'll soar. The only thing that really soared was our unemployment rate after passing that program. So we did not do particularly well for job growth compared to what we were doing prior to these programs. Housing is a really big issue, and even, especially, up here in Petoskey, Traverse City, a lot of competition for housing, but really across the state. And it's very important, especially for attracting young people or early professionals that do want to go to places that they can really afford to live. When you're a college student, or even those first couple of years where you're willing to rent, or you're not really thinking about where you're going to set down roots, you have to compete for those people in different ways. But when you're trying to attract families, one of the most important things is abundant housing options, a variety of housing options that kind of change with what people want. So Michigan's overall kind of middle of the pack for how we regulate housing. If you look at our property and land use freedom, it's not particularly competitive, it's not particularly bad. But if you go to Metro Detroit has some of the worst housing policy laws in the state, zoning laws. And Traverse City is not particularly better, though Ann Arbor and Traverse City at least have been talking about doing something in these areas. But Metro Detroit has lots of different rules in place that do a lot to prevent housing and prevent different types of housing. And one of the things that captures just the ease of housing is the number of permits that we're handing out. So the early part, if you go back to the 1990s, early 2000s, we were approving 2 to 3 times the amount of housing permits as there are today. Even these last couple of years coming out of COVID, where we've had a huge spike in demand for housing, we still aren't getting as many permits approved as we used to. And that is a suggestion of policy failure. That means it's harder. You do not have property developers that are like, well, I don't really want to make money, so I guess I won't provide housing for people. This suggests that they're running into roadblocks. And if you talk to property developers, they will tell you they are running into a lot of roadblocks. Governor Whitmer has talked about this issue. She has said she's the build, baby, build governor. Here's housing permits under the build, baby, build governor. Pretty minimal. And in fact, at the state level, she has pursued, her state housing department has gone kind of all in on subsidizing low or mid-income housing, which is very expensive and takes a very long time to kind of show up into what we need. And really, most of that money is going to rehabbing apartment buildings. So it's not approval of a lot of new housing. The next issue is labor flexibility and choice. If you look at union membership over time, it has declined, and it particularly declined when Michigan was a right-to-work state. No surprise, if you could choose whether you wanted to be in a union or pay money to a union, the rate went down a lot. So this has been becoming less of a part of our system, fewer unionized employees in the public sector and in the private sector than we used to have, but unions still control a significant number of our industries. Almost every public school employee in Michigan works under a collective bargaining agreement. There are lots of states, including growth states like North Carolina and Virginia and Texas, where very few teachers work under collective bargaining agreements. You have states like Florida, where they regularly have people have to vote to approve to keep their union around. And once they actually have that vote to truly regularly every year or two, surprise, surprise, sometimes unions don't get reapproved if they get disconnected from their membership. Unions dominate kind of the construction industry, even though construction workers, only about 15% of construction workers in Michigan are unionized. We still have laws on the books like prevailing wage law that got brought back, project labor agreements, where even if you're hiring non-union workers and doing non-union work, if you're working on government construction or road projects, you have to follow all these parts of the collective bargaining process. If you look at a rating of state labor laws, worker freedom, so on things like, is it a right-to-work state, how easy it is for someone to move from one employer to another employer, how much effect do unions have on the policy environment in the state. Indiana's an A+, Wisconsin's an A, and then Michigan's down. We do beat Illinois, so we're hanging on with that D-. So we're not the worst, but we were much better for some years there. And labor flexibility is really kind of the name of the game. Like nowadays, where people do need a lot of flexibility in those work environments and employers want flexibility, kind of being stuck with these contracts makes it very difficult to become more efficient. Fiscal responsibility. So we want a fiscally responsible state. And this first chart is a measure of our overall stability. So it's looking at like how much debt does the state have? How much do we spend on interest rates? What's our rating in our credit rating or our ratings in the bond market? And Michigan has a lot of debt. Joe mentioned in the introduction, Governor Whitmer, really the only significant policy she's done in terms of road spending was about the worst thing you could do in this area, which is she used her unilateral authority to borrow money to do a one-time, rolled out over a couple of years, borrowing of $1.5 billion to spend on roads. But we got to pay that off over the next 20, 25 years. So we're going to have to pay back something like $3 billion to $4 billion to borrow $1.5 billion. So that is a knock on your fiscal stability, fiscal responsibility. It's not a good idea to take out a short-term loan for roads and pay it off over the long term. I talked about our school retirement system debt, where it's eating up more and more of our state's budget. So the amount that we owe for pension debt and retiree health care debt. So cities, luckily, have begun moving off of these types of programs towards more generous 401k, where you know exactly what you pay every year. Governor Engler in the 90s got state employees off of a pension system. They are on a 401k type system. And that has provided stability for the worker, but more importantly, stability for the taxpayers. And I've talked with our fiscal policy guy, James Homan, before, and he's like, look, even if even if you want to go out and do a 20% match on somebody's 401k or something really generous where they're still going to have a great retirement, go negotiate and do that. At least we know exactly what it's costing you every year. The problem with the pension system is you're trying to do all these projections over decades and decades from now. And so what happens is when states and cities get into financial trouble, which has happened on and off over the years, and especially during those great recession years, what they do is they cut back on spending on their pension systems. And you would have thought that in the early 2000s, when we're going through these recession years, where the state was doing things, cutting back on pension payments, assuming unrealistic ages, very low ages that these pensioners were going to live to. They basically assumed they were going to live much less than they did live, making assumptions about stock market returns that were very wildly unrealistic. You would have thought that a labor union would have been out there saying, whoa, hold on. These are our members. We kind of want this money to be there for them off in the future, but they were silent. And so you actually need groups that are calling attention to things like this besides a few principled politicians. And it's gotten to the point where we're just going to be spending years digging out of this hole. But hopefully we can stop digging. And in some ways we have passed a couple of pretty serious reforms to this system. This is state of Michigan spending compared to inflation. So those last couple years under Snyder administration, it kind of tracked with inflation, and then we really spiked up. And this is not looking at this federal COVID money. This is state spending from state lawmakers. So they really hiked up the amount that they were spending. They didn't give that money back to taxpayers to help them deal with inflation, and they didn't put that money into roads or kind of this long-term investment. They started a bunch of new programs that were out there that are going to be very, very difficult to kind of roll back. And so having a good fiscal responsibility, keeping an eye on spending, what the Mackinac Center calls for is that state spending should not go above the rate of inflation or population growth. That's a sustainable Michigan budget, and that would help with a lot of these spending problems. Michigan is about 10 million people. And the next closest state in our size is the state of North Carolina. Has anyone been to North Carolina? Okay. So North Carolina spends 40% less in their state budget than the state of Michigan. So I assume when you went to North Carolina, it was like, starving people everywhere. The roads were completely falling apart. They didn't have schools or none of that? Oh, okay. I think they have pretty good public policy down there. They have pretty good programs. Certainly a lot of people are moving down there. And we have some things where we have weatherization issues where our roads are a little more expensive and things like that. But for the most part, state spending is state spending. There's not a lot of difference. And you should really question what are we getting for spending 40% more in our state budget than the state of North Carolina, which also is supporting 10 million residents. It's a suggestion that we are not being particularly fiscally responsible. All right, so solving this is going to require principled people, like I think most of the room is. It's going to require persistence. I don't want to leave you with like this feeling of dread. We are happy optimists at the Mackinac Center. We believe Michigan has a brighter future, and we are much better off than those early days of statehood where the state was almost bankrupt. And so I think we had a lot of optimists then that said we're going to solve these problems, and I hope that's what the people here in this room will do. I'm reminded of a story of persistence. About 10 years ago, so my dad was, I mentioned, working in public schools. He was like a shop teacher, architecture, but he worked construction on the side. So he did mostly decks and roofs and things like that. So I grew up working for my dad, which helped me a lot when I got out there and started as an intern at the Mackinac Center. And so me and my wife, we bought our first house. And so we bought like two foreclosures, short sales, and fixed them up and then moved to the next house and did it again. And so the first house that I was living in, we were doing a variety of projects, and one of them was I was roofing. So I would like trying to get this done over the weekend, and so I had to, the way the house was kind of like 2-level rant. So I had to take one ladder and get up on the garage and have another ladder that was a little more precipitous on the angle of the roof and get up on the higher level. So I'm up there roofing, and we had a 2.5-year-old, and then we had a new baby. So my wife was nursing the new baby. But I was getting started really early, and I'm like, I don't know what to do with the kids. Like, sorry, I'm going to be up here roofing. Sorry, honey, you'll have to deal with them. But I'm up at the far end of the roof, and for the day before, my 2.5-year-old son would just like be mesmerized at me up on this roof. He would just sit in the lawn and just eat his lunch and just watch me. And he so badly wanted to be on this roof. And my wife would be out in the yard, and he would kind of go up and circle and try to and she'd have to pull him back and be like, we can't go on the roof, it's too dangerous. So it's like 7:30 in the morning, and I'm up there in the end, and something catches out of the corner of my eye. So I look down from this 2 level, and I see my 2.5-year-old on the top of the ladder. So he'd climbed up the one ladder, climbed up the other ladder, got onto the roof, and was making his way down towards me. So I know, I apologize, I don't want to scare anyone, but I did grab a picture of him. So I'm up on the roof, and I did it just so I could take the picture, and I texted my wife, guess where your son is at right now, and I had a lot of fun with that. So he had a lot of persistence to make it up there. He got his 5 minutes on the roof, and we hauled him back down. But I hope we will all be at least as persistent as my 2.5-year-old.